In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man whose tongue was the most valuable instrument his employer owned. 22 years reading Recaff the way a Lex mechanic reads data, 9 parts per billion of variance, no spectrometer more accurate. Then one morning, the cup was wrong. And what frightened him wasn't the taste, it was the silence after he reported it. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Kellun Dresk, blend-assayer on a Hive world, the man who tasted what kept the Imperium's workforce on its feet, the only thing standing between mankind and a workforce too exhausted to serve. Most people never wonder what's actually in the cup. He spent his life finding out. And on one ordinary morning, his tongue told him something had changed in the supply chain for an entire subsector, something that was going to kill a great many people, and that no one would lift a finger to stop. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The cup was wrong. I knew it the way a blind man knows when someone has moved the furniture in his room. Not from evidence, not from logic. From 22 years of putting liquid against my palate and reading it the way a Lex mechanic reads data thread. The cup was wrong and nobody in the assay hall cared, and that was the first thing that should have frightened me. Not the taste, the silence that followed when I reported it. My name is Kellun Dresk. I was a blend-assayer for mercantile compact Verodin on the Hive world of Threnach Septimus, and for 22 years my tongue was the most valuable instrument the compact owned. More accurate than a chem sniffer, more reliable than a mass spectrometer. My tongue could detect 9 parts per billion of pheromoxine variance in a standard Recaff infusion. It could distinguish between leaf stalk harvested from the northern and southern hemispheres of the same agri-world. It could tell you, within a margin of 3 Terran days, how long a shipment had been in transit through the void. And on the morning of the 4th day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, in the 41st year of my life, my tongue told me that something fundamental had changed in the Recaff supply chain for the entire Corvalin subsector, and that whatever had changed was going to kill a lot of people, and that nobody was going to do anything about it. My tongue was right about all of it. I should explain what I did for a living because most people think Recaff is Recaff. They think it comes from a leaf, gets crushed and brewed, and that's the end of the story. They drink it every morning and every shift change, and every time they need their hands to stop shaking after 12 hours on a manufactorum line, and they never once wonder what's actually in the cup. I don't blame them. I didn't wonder either, not for the first 15 years. You don't question the air you breathe. You don't question the water in your ration pipe. And you absolutely do not question the Recaff. Because Recaff is the only thing standing between the Imperium of man and a workforce that's too exhausted to serve. Recaff. The word itself tells you more than the Administratum would like. Recaff. Recaffeinated, meaning that whatever stimulant compound lives in the liquid, it was removed at some point and then put back in. Think about that. Someone, at some point in the deep history of this drink, took the caffeine out and then deliberately reintroduced it. Why would you do that? You do it because you want to control the dosage. You do it because you want to decide exactly how much stimulant goes into every cup, on every world, for every grade of worker. You do it because the drink was never really about the taste or the warmth or the comfort of wrapping your cracked hands around a tin cup at 4 in the morning. It was about the chemical payload. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Threnach Septimus is a hive world in the mid-reaches of the Segmentum Obscurus, and it is exactly as miserable as that sounds. 14 billion souls packed into 6 hive clusters, each one a vertical city that punches through the cloud layer and keeps going until the air gets too thin to breathe. The hive I lived in, Hive Morren, was the second largest. 47 million people crammed into a structure originally designed for 30. The lower levels hadn't seen natural light in recorded history. The upper spires, where the noble families played their political games, had actual windows made of armor glass, and the sunlight that came through them was the color of old parchment because of the atmospheric pollution. Between the spires and the underhive where I lived, there was the mid-hive, a compressed band of humanity where people like me worked, slept, ate, worked again, and drank Recaff. We drank a lot of Recaff. The mercantile compact Verodin operated out of a trade block on level 47 of Hive Morren's commercial district. We were not a large operation. We employed perhaps 800 people across procurement, logistics, assay, blending, packaging, and distribution. We handled approximately 2% of the Recaff that moved through the Corvalin subsector, which sounds insignificant until you understand the scale. 2% of the subsector's Recaff supply meant roughly 400 million individual servings per standard Terran day. We were, by the standards of the trade, a minor house. There were compacts that handled 10 times our volume. There were Administratum licensed distributors that made us look like street vendors. But we had a reputation for quality, and that reputation was built on the assay division, and the assay division was built on people like me. There were 12 of us in the assay hall. 12 blend-assayers, each responsible for evaluating incoming raw stock, testing processed blends, and certifying outgoing product for distribution. We worked in shifts of 4-8 hours at a time, tasting between 300 and 500 individual samples per shift. The work was meticulous. Each sample was prepared according to a standardized protocol. 10 grams of processed leaf or blend powder dissolved in 200 milliliters of water, heated to exactly 87 degrees. The sample was poured into a ceramic tasting cup, white glazed on the interior, so we could evaluate color. We would observe the color, note the clarity, assess the aroma, and then taste. A proper assessment took between 40 and 90 seconds per sample. We would draw the liquid across our palate, hold it, evaluate the primary notes, the body, the finish, and then spit it into a brass receptacle. We always spat. You never swallow during an assay session. Swallowing throws off your palate for the next sample, and if you're tasting 400 cups a day, swallowing would put enough stimulant into your system to stop your heart by week's end. That was the protocol. That was the rule, and that rule mattered more than any of us understood. The best assayer who ever worked for the compact was a man named Vorsk Pellant. He trained me. 29 years on the tasting line, a palate so refined that procurement agents from other compacts tried to poach him twice a year. Vosk could taste mineral variants at concentrations that spectrometers needed 3 passes to detect. He retired 6 years ago at 58, healthy, sharp, still the best tongue in the division. I visited him 4 months after his retirement at his HAB unit on level 36. He was drinking Recaff, properly drinking it. A full pot every morning, another in the evening. He told me he'd never actually enjoyed Recaff before, not in the full swallowing, savoring sense, because the protocol had always required him to spit. Now that he was retired, he said, he was finally going to drink the stuff he'd spent his career evaluating. I visited him again 8 months later. His hands shook. He had trouble finishing sentences. His eyes had a flatness to them that I attributed to age or loneliness, or the peculiar emptiness that settles into people who define themselves by their work and then stop working. I visited him one more time a year after that. He did not recognize me. He sat in his hab unit with a cup of Grade Tertius in his hands and a blank bovine contentment on his face. And when I said his name, he looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved into an unfamiliar position. The other assayers said it was cognitive decline, early onset. It happens. I accepted that explanation because the alternative was unthinkable. Now I know what happened to Vorsak Pellant. 29 years of spitting had kept his mind clear, and 2 years of swallowing had erased it. The Recaff trade operates on a grading system that most consumers never see. At the top, you have Grade Primus, genuine leaf stock, minimally processed, often single origin, from a specific agri-world. Grade Primus Recaff tastes like something alive. It has depth, complexity, a finish that lingers on the soft palate like a memory you can't quite place. It is consumed by planetary governors, senior Administratum officials, rogue traders, Navy admirals, and the very wealthiest of Hive Spire nobility. I tasted Grade Primus perhaps twice a year when a special shipment came through for authentication. It was like hearing music after a lifetime of industrial noise. Below that sits Grade Secundus, blended leaf stock, usually from multiple sources processed and standardized. Grade Secundus is what a well-paid Manufactorum overseer might drink, or a mid-ranking Administratum clerk. It tastes competent, professional, like the difference between a hand-forged blade and a mass-produced one. Both cut, but one of them has a soul. Grade Secundus was the bread and butter of our compact. We moved tremendous volumes of it, and our reputation depended on maintaining consistent quality across thousands of blended batches per year. Then you drop into Grade Tertius, and this is where the story gets dark. Grade Tertius is what most people in the Imperium actually drink. It is what the Manufactorum worker drinks, what the guardsman drinks, what the hab clerk and the sanitation laborer, and the transit conductor and the dock hand and the corpse handler, and the lumen technician and the billions upon billions of other souls who keep the Imperium's machinery grinding forward all drink every day, multiple times a day. Grade Tertius Recaff is not, strictly speaking, made from leaves. The official classification states that it must contain a minimum of 12% leaf-derived content by dry weight. The remaining 88% is synthetic, chemical stimulants, flavoring compounds, stabilizers, colorants, and a base filler that the industry refers to as organic substrate. The Administratum's Bureau of Consumable Standards certifies Grade Tertius as leaf product adjacent. I always appreciated the honesty of that phrasing. Adjacent, not leaf product, not even leaf derived. Adjacent, standing next to the real thing and hoping nobody looks too closely. Below Grade Tertius, there is Grade Quartus, which is what they serve in the underhive, in penal colonies, in the lowest tier guard rations, and in places where the word quality has been redacted from the local vocabulary. Grade Quartus is not Recaff by any meaningful definition. It is a hot, brown, caffeinated liquid. It tastes like someone described Recaff to a servitor, and the servitor made its best attempt. I was not required to assay Grade Quartus. Nobody was. It was manufactured by automated processing plants and shipped in bulk drums. And if a batch was contaminated or tainted or simply wrong, nobody complained because the people drinking it had no frame of reference for what right tasted like. I knew all of this. Every blend-assayer knew it. We joked about Grade Quartus. We called it the Mercy because drinking it made you grateful for anything better. But we didn't question the system. The system was the system. The Imperium required Recaff. The Imperium produced Recaff. The Imperium consumed Recaff. The grading existed to ensure that the right quality reached the right people, and if the definition of quality shifted depending on how far down the hive you lived, well, that was the Imperium. That was how things worked. I tasted, I graded, I blended. I did not ask questions until the cup was wrong. The sample that morning was a Grade Tertius blend stock from Solvon Prime, an agri-world in the Corvalin subsector that had been supplying raw material to our compact for as long as I'd been working. Solvon Prime was a reliable source, consistent, predictable. The leaf stock from Solvon had a characteristic profile, a flat mineral base note, a mildly astringent body, and a short, clean finish. Not exciting, not complex, but consistent, which in the Recaff trade is worth more than excitement. You can blend a consistent base stock into almost anything. It's the foundation on which you build. I took the sample through the standard protocol. Color, acceptable. A dark amber within standard range. Clarity, slight turbidity, normal for Solvon stock due to mineral content. Aroma. That's where I paused. The aroma had a top note I didn't recognize. Something sharp. Not chemical sharp like a contaminant. Not bitter sharp like over-processed leaf. Something else. Something that reminded me of the smell of a cogitator's innards when the casing is cracked open. Metallic but biological. Like blood that's been heated. I tasted. I drew the liquid across my palate and held it, and the metallic note was there, underneath everything else, woven into the body of the blend, like a thread of wrong-colored wire braided into a cable. It was subtle. A consumer wouldn't taste it. Even most assayers might miss it if they weren't paying attention. But my palate was tuned to Solvon stock, the way a musician's ear is tuned to a familiar instrument. I knew what this leaf was supposed to taste like, and this wasn't it. Spitting, rinsing, a neutral cracker to reset the palate, then a second sample from the same batch. Tasted again. The note was still there. A third sample from a different batch in the same shipment. Still there. 6 batches from the most recent Solvon delivery, and every single one carried that same metallic undertone. I logged it, filed a deviation report with Provost Hannek Drull, who ran the assay division. Hannek was a careful man, thorough in his way, and he'd been running assay for 3 years longer than I'd been working. He tasted the samples himself and frowned. "I don't get it," he said. "It's in the body," I told him, "under the mineral base, metallic, warm." He tasted again, shook his head. "Might be mineral variance. Solvon's been running heavy cycles. Could be soil depletion affecting the leaf." Soil depletion gives you a flat profile, not a new note. This is an addition, not a subtraction. Hannek looked at me the way he always looked at me when I pushed back. Patient, slightly annoyed, fundamentally uninterested in being wrong. Run the chem analysis. If the spectrometer doesn't flag it, we ship it. I ran the chem analysis. The spectrometer didn't flag it. The batch fell within standard deviation for all 217 chemical markers that the Bureau of Consumable Standards required for Grade Tertius certification. By every measurable standard, the Recaff was fine. It shipped. I stood in the assay hall after the last shift and stared at the empty tasting cups and tried to make myself believe that my palate was wrong, that 22 years of training and experience had finally degraded, that I was tasting ghosts. But I'd been doing this too long, and the thing about a trained palate is that it doesn't lie. Cogitators can be miscalibrated. Spectrometers can miss what they aren't programmed to find. But a human tongue, properly trained, registers everything, even the things nobody wants to know about. I went home to my HAB unit on level 39. It was a single room with a cot, a sanitary alcove, a small cook plate, and a Recaff brewer. The brewer was a personal unit, a luxury in the mid-hive, and I'd spent 3 months' wages on it because I'm the kind of person who cares about these things. I kept a small supply of Grade Secundus at home, purchased at discount through the compact. That night, I brewed a cup from my personal stock. Different source, different grade, different blend entirely. I sat on my cot and held the cup under my nose and breathed in the steam and waited for the familiar notes to tell me everything was normal. The metallic note was there, faint, almost imperceptible, but there like a whisper in a quiet room. I put the cup down. I did not drink it. I sat in my hab unit and stared at the wall and thought about what it meant if the contamination wasn't limited to Sulvan Prime. If it was in our blended stock, too. If it was in everything. I should have gone to sleep. I should have filed another report and let the system handle it. I should have done what everyone else in the Imperium does when they notice something wrong. Nothing. Nothing is the safest response. Nothing keeps you employed. Nothing keeps you alive. But I was a blend-assayer, and the one thing a blend-assayer cannot do is ignore a bad taste. It's not discipline. It's not courage. It's compulsion. Once your palate registers something wrong, it won't let go. It sits in the back of your mouth like a word you can't remember, and it stays there until you either identify it or go mad. I did not go mad, but I came close enough to see the border. The next morning, I started pulling records, not because anyone asked me to, not because it was my job. A blend-assayer's responsibilities end at the tasting cup. We evaluate, we grade, we certify. What happens upstream in the procurement chain, in the agri-world fields, in the processing plants and the bulk carrier holds and the distribution warehouses, that belongs to other departments, other people, other desks. But I had access to the Compact's trade archive because part of my job involved comparing current stock against historical profiles, and the trade archive contained shipping manifests, origin certificates, processing logs, and tithe compliance records going back decades. I started with Sulvan Prime. The world had been classified as an agri-world for at least 800 standard years, designated under Administratum code as a primary yield agricultural producer with a focus on stimulant crop cultivation. In plainer language, the entire planet existed to grow Recaff leaf. That was its tithe. That was its purpose. That was the reason Sulvan Prime had a population at all. The last census, dated 11 years prior, listed the planet's total population at 62 million souls, nearly all of them engaged in agricultural labor. 62 million people spread across a world roughly the size of Terra, doing nothing but growing, harvesting, and processing Recaff leaf for shipment to the Hive Worlds and Forge Worlds and guard supply depots of the Corvalin subsector and beyond. I want you to understand what that looks like because the Administratum's propaganda reels don't show it. They show green fields under blue skies, workers with brown skin and honest smiles, baskets overflowing with rich dark leaves. They show children playing between rows of hip-high bushes. They show sunsets that look like paintings from old Terra. They show everything except the truth. An agri-world dedicated to stimulant crop production is a chemical wasteland. The leaf requires specific soil conditions, acidic, nitrogen-rich, heavily mineralized. Natural soil can sustain perhaps 3 or 4 growing cycles before it's exhausted. The Imperium doesn't have time for 3 or 4 growing cycles. The Imperium needs continuous yield. So the soil is saturated with industrial fertilizers, nitrate compounds so concentrated that the topsoil turns orange and the air above the fields becomes a haze of ammonia and phosphate particulate that will burn your lungs raw in minutes. The workers wear filtration masks. The workers always wear filtration masks. After a few years, many of them have the masks surgically bonded to their faces because the skin around the seal line has been corroded by chemical exposure and won't hold a standard fit anymore. They breathe through the mask. They eat through a feeding port in the mask. Some of them die with the mask on, because by the time the medical servitors get to them, the mask has fused with the underlying bone structure, and removing it would kill them faster than whatever else is already killing them. The fields stretch from horizon to horizon, not fields as you might picture them, with boundaries and hedgerows and paths between plots. Endless, unbroken expanses of dark-leafed bushes planted in rows so tight that a human body can barely fit between them. The bushes themselves are not natural. They were gene-tailored millennia ago to maximize leaf production, short, dense, with leaves the size of a man's hand, so thick with alkaloid compounds that they're mildly toxic to the touch if you handle them without gloves. The harvest is done by hand, because the mechanicus has determined that mechanical harvesting damages the leaf structure and reduces stimulant yield by 4%. And 4% across an entire planet's output is a number large enough to trigger an Administratum audit. So the workers pick by hand. 62 million people picking leaves by hand, 16 hours a day, in air that will dissolve their lung tissue if their filtration fails. That's an agri-world. That's where your morning cup comes from. I pulled the shipping manifests for the last 2 years of Sulvon Prime deliveries to our compact. Volume was consistent. Timing was consistent. Chemical certification was consistent. On paper, nothing had changed. But I noticed something in the origin certificates that I hadn't been looking for. The processing facility codes. Every shipment of raw leaf stock from an agri-world carries a processing facility code, a string of numbers and letters that identifies which on-planet facility handled the initial drying, curing, and packaging of the leaf. Sulvon Prime had, according to the records, 17 registered processing facilities. Over the past 2 years, all 17 had continued to ship product. But in the last 8 months, a disproportionate volume, nearly 40% of total output, was coming from a single facility. Processing Station Tertius Novum, located in the equatorial growing zone. That was unusual. Processing facilities on agri-worlds are distributed across the planet to minimize transport time from field to station because the leaf begins to degrade the moment it's picked. You don't route 40% of a planet's output through a single facility unless something has changed at the other 16. I checked the individual station outputs. They were all still reporting. They were all still shipping. But their volumes had decreased, each by a small percentage, and the aggregate of those small decreases was being absorbed by Tertius Novum. It was as if the planet was slowly, quietly consolidating its production into one facility, and doing it in a way that the overall numbers remained steady enough that nobody in procurement would notice. Nobody except someone who was looking. And I was looking, because my tongue had told me to look. I took my findings to Hannock. He listened with the expression of a man who has been interrupted during something more important and is being patient about it. When I finished, he folded his hands on his desk and said the thing that I already knew he would say. The spectrometer cleared it, Kellun. The spectrometer tests for 217 markers. There are thousands of compounds in a standard Recaff infusion that aren't on the marker list. Because they don't matter, the marker list covers everything that affects consumer safety, stimulant dosage, and regulatory compliance. If a compound isn't on the list, it's because the Bureau of Consumable Standards has determined that it's irrelevant. or because they don't know it exists." That was the wrong thing to say. Hannock's expression shifted from patient to something colder. The Bureau of Consumable Standards was an Administratum body, suggesting that the Administratum had missed something was not technically heretical, but it was the kind of statement that could make your life very uncomfortable if it reached the wrong ears. "File a supplementary report if you want," he said. "Note your pallet observations, reference the processing facility variance, send it to procurement, and let them decide if it warrants an inquiry. That's the process, Kellun. Follow the process." I filed the supplementary report. I sent it to procurement. And then I did something that was not the process at all. There was a man named Mikkel Torve who worked the loading docks on level 12 in the lower commercial district where the bulk carriers unloaded their cargo into the compact's warehousing network. Mikkel was not an assayer, he was a cargo handler, a man who spent his shifts moving crates and drums and pressurized containers from freight lifts to storage bays. He was also, unofficially, the kind of person who could acquire things. Not contraband, not exactly. More like parallel procurement. If you needed a sample of something that hadn't been through official channels, Mikkel could get it for you. He had contacts on the bulk carriers, void ratings, and deckhands who understood that a small amount of cargo occasionally went missing in transit, and that the insurance adjustments were cheaper than the bribes required to make people care. I found Mikkel in a drinking hole on level 13, a narrow establishment called the Rust Cup, which served exactly one beverage. Grade Tertius Recaff, heated to just below boiling to mask the taste, served in dented tin cups that had been passed through so many hands that the Imperial aquila stamped into the base had been worn smooth. I sat down across from him and told him what I needed. "Raw leaf," I said, "unprocessed, from Solvon Prime, specifically from the equatorial growing zone. As close to field harvest condition as you can get." Mikkel looked at me the way a man looks at someone who's just asked him to do something that's either very simple or very dangerous, and he's trying to figure out which. Raw leaf costs more than processed. Nobody ships raw leaf. By the time it leaves the planet, it's already been through primary processing. "I know. That's why I need it raw, before processing station Tertius Novum touches it." He took a sip of his Recaff, grimaced, and put the cup down. Mikkel was not a man who appreciated the finer points of flavor. He drank Recaff the way most people in the mid-hive drank it, as a delivery mechanism for stimulant, nothing more. But he looked at my face, and whatever he saw there was apparently convincing enough. 2 weeks. He drained the cup. "And it'll cost you." It cost me more than a month's wages for a small sealed container of unprocessed leaf stock smuggled off a Solvon-bound cargo shuttle by a void rating who probably thought he was facilitating some kind of exotic drug trade. When the container arrived, I took it to the assay hall after hours, when the other shift had gone and I had the tasting stations to myself. I broke the seal, and the smell hit me immediately. Recaff leaf, in its raw state, has a sharp vegetal aroma, green and acrid, like fresh-cut vegetation soaked in something chemical. The leaves from Solvon had always carried a heavier mineral tone, reflective of the planet's soil composition. But this sample was different. The leaves were darker than I expected, almost black at the veination, with a faintly iridescent sheen on the undersurface that I had never seen on any leaf from any world in 22 years of assaying, and the smell had that note in it, the metallic note, stronger here in the raw leaf than it had been in the processed blend. Not a processing artifact, not something introduced in the curing or the packaging or the blending. Something in the leaf itself, growing in the leaf. I prepared the sample. Standard protocol, adjusted for raw leaf, 15 grams instead of 10, coarser grind, same water temperature. The resulting infusion was darker than normal, and when I held the cup under the hall's lumen strip, I could see a faint amber turbidity that moved through the liquid like something alive. Not sediment. Sediment sinks. This moved laterally, slowly, as if it had somewhere to be. I tasted, and what my palate told me made me put the cup down and sit very still for a long time. The metallic note wasn't a contaminant. It wasn't a chemical byproduct of over-fertilization or soil depletion, or any of the 100 mundane explanations that a reasonable person would reach for. It was organic. It was biological. It tasted the way living tissue tastes when it's been broken down into its constituent compounds and absorbed into a plant's vascular system. I knew this taste. Every blend-assayer knows it because it shows up in the cheapest grades of Recaff when the organic substrate used as filler isn't properly filtered. We call it ghost flesh. The taste of something that used to be alive, processed beyond recognition but not beyond detection. Not if you know what you're looking for. The Recaff leaf from Solvon Prime tasted like it had been grown in something that used to be human. I rinsed my mouth. I sat in the assay hall. The lumens hummed above me, and somewhere below, in the deep levels of the hive, 47 million people were waking up and reaching for their morning cup, and every single cup contained a trace of whatever I had just tasted, diluted and processed and blended into invisibility, but present, there, always there, in every sip. I did not file a report. Not this time. Reports go into the system, and the system had already shown me that it didn't want to know. Instead, I started asking questions that blend-assayers are not supposed to ask. Questions about soil composition and agricultural chemistry and the precise nature of the organic substrate that constitutes 88% of every cup of Grade Tertius Recaff consumed across the Imperium. Questions that led me places I did not want to go. The organic substrate. Let me tell you about the organic substrate, because it's the part of the Recaff story that nobody talks about. The Administratum's Bureau of Consumable Standards defines organic substrate as any carbon-based filler material derived from processed biological sources suitable for incorporation into consumable products at concentrations determined by regulatory standard. That's the official definition. It is masterfully vague. Carbon-based filler material. Processed biological sources. The words are designed to mean everything and nothing simultaneously, to provide legal cover for a practice that has been standard across the Imperium for longer than anyone can remember. On most hive worlds, organic substrate comes from two primary sources. The first is agricultural waste, stalks, roots, husks, and other non-edible plant matter left over from food production, ground into powder and processed into a neutral filler. This is the organic substrate that appears in the Administratum's educational materials. Clean, simple, almost wholesome. Plant waste recycled into a useful product. Nothing wrong with that. The second source is not in the educational materials. On a hive world, biological waste is a resource. It has to be. When you have 47 million people generating biological waste every day, you either process it or you drown in it. The waste processing plants in the lower hive take in everything: sewage, medical waste, industrial biological runoff, and the dead especially. In the mid-hive, when someone dies, the body is collected by the mortuary division and sent to the lower-level processing plants, where it is rendered down into its constituent organic components. Some of this rendered material goes into the nutrient recycling system that feeds the hydroponic farms in the hive's agricultural sublevels. Some of it goes into structural compounds, because organic polymers bonded with plasteel make excellent insulation. And some of it, after sufficient processing and chemical treatment, enters the food chain as organic substrate. This is not a secret. Not exactly. It's one of those truths that everyone knows and nobody says out loud. The Recaff you drink contains traces of recycled biological material that may, at some point in its processing chain, have been part of a human being. The concentrations are minute. The processing removes anything recognizable. By the time it reaches your cup, it is, chemically speaking, just carbon and nitrogen and trace minerals, completely inert, completely safe, completely legal. The Bureau of Consumable Standards has certified it 1,000 times over. But here's the thing. That familiar background note, the one that assayers call ghost flesh, is present in processed blends where recycled substrate is used as filler. I know what it tastes like. I've been tasting it my entire career. What I found in the raw leaf from Solvon Prime was not ghost flesh from the filler. It was ghost flesh from the leaf itself. The plant had absorbed it. Whatever was in the soil of Solvon Prime, it had entered the leaf through the root system and become part of the plant's biological structure. The contamination wasn't in the processing. It was in the agriculture. And if it was in the agriculture, it was in every single leaf that grew in that soil, not just the ones that ended up as Grade Tertius filler, but the ones that became Grade Secundus blends and Emperor Help Us, even the ones that were sold as Grade Primus single origin product. I needed to know what was in the soil. Going to Solvon Prime myself was not an option. A blend-assayer does not have the authority, the resources, or the clearance to travel off-world on a personal investigation into agricultural chemistry. I was a mid-hive tradesman with a sensitive tongue. The void between worlds was not meant for people like me. But the compact was sending a procurement delegation to Solvon Prime in 6 weeks, a routine inspection visit to verify source compliance and negotiate the next cycle's supply contracts. The delegation would include 2 procurement agents, a logistics coordinator, and, under standard protocol, 1 assayer to evaluate current harvest quality on site. Normally, the on-site assayer was selected by rotation, and the rotation said it was Darva Kellich's turn. Darva was competent, thorough, and entirely uninterested in anything beyond the tasting cup. She would go to Solvon, taste the samples the processing stations put in front of her, certify them, and come home. She would not notice the metallic note because she wasn't looking for it. She would not ask about the soil because that wasn't her job. I traded shifts with Darva, told her I wanted the travel credit for my record, which was plausible enough. She was happy to stay in Hive Morren. Nobody wants to spend 3 weeks in the void and another 2 on an agri-world breathing filtered air through a bonded mask. I submitted the rotation change to Hannock, who approved it without comment. He had stopped asking me about the Solvon deviation. He had stopped asking me about anything. He just looked at me sometimes across the assay hall with an expression I couldn't read. Not hostile, not concerned. Flat. Like the expression on the face of a man who's decided something about you but hasn't told you what. The voyage to Solvon Prime took 19 days aboard a bulk carrier called the Anvil of Sufficient Grace, a mass conveyor 12 kilometers long designed to haul agricultural product from the agri-worlds to the hive clusters. The ship was almost empty on the outbound trip, carrying only the delegation and a skeleton crew, plus cargo holds full of empty storage containers and industrial fertilizer drums bound for the planet's growing operations. The return journey would fill every hold with processed leaf stock, enough Recaff to supply Threnach Septimus for a quarter cycle. The ship smelled of old metal and stale air and the chemical residue of 1,000 previous cargoes. And at night, in my berth, I could feel the shudder of the engines through the hull like a pulse, like a heartbeat, like the ship was alive. I spent the voyage reviewing everything I could access about Solvon Prime's agricultural operations. The Compact's records gave me the commercial picture, yield data, pricing history, contract terms. But I wanted the planetary picture, and for that I had to dig into the ship's navigation archives, which contained basic Administratum briefings for every world on the trade route. What I found was sparse but telling. Solvon Prime had been classified as an agri-world for 8 centuries. Prior to that, it had been designated as a frontier world during the initial colonization wave that settled the Corvalin subsector. The original settlers had been drawn by the planet's unusually fertile soil, which turned out to be rich in nitrogen and trace minerals in concentrations that made it ideal for stimulant crop cultivation. The Recaff leaf they planted thrived. Within a century, the planet had been reclassified, its population redirected entirely toward agricultural production, and its tithe obligations adjusted accordingly. 8 centuries of continuous cultivation, 8 centuries of growing the same crop in the same soil, stripping it of nutrients, flooding it with industrial fertilizer, and harvesting every scrap of organic material that the planet produced. The navigation briefing noted, in the bland language of Administratum record-keeping, that Solvon Prime had experienced progressive soil degradation, requiring increasing chemical supplementation. In other words, the planet was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, just slowly, steadily, being drained of everything that made it useful and being kept artificially alive by an ever-increasing injection of chemical support, like a patient on life support, like a body being kept functioning long past the point where natural systems had failed. The briefing also noted that Solvon Prime had experienced 3 changes of planetary governor in the last 12 years. That was the detail I'd found in the shipping manifests, and seeing it confirmed in the navigation archive made it feel more real. 3 governors in 12 years was unusual. Governors of agri-worlds tended to hold their positions for decades because the job was straightforward. Meet the tithe, maintain production, don't attract attention. A governor who did those 3 things could rule until they died of old age. 3 changes meant 3 failures. 3 governors who had, for whatever reason, not met the Administratum's requirements. The briefing did not say what happened to them. It didn't need to. There is only one consequence for a governor who fails the tithe. We arrived at Solvon Prime on a gray morning, which is to say that every morning on Solvon Prime is gray, because the atmosphere is a permanent haze of fertilizer particulate and industrial emission that turns the sky the color of old bone. The planet looked sick from orbit. You could see the growing zones from space. Vast geometric blocks of dark vegetation stretching from pole to pole, broken only by the thin lines of transit corridors connecting the processing stations and the squat clusters of worker habitation blocks. There were no cities, no forests, no bodies of water visible from the observation deck, just fields. Fields that covered every landmass, every valley, every slope gentle enough to hold soil. Fields that had devoured the planet's original ecology and replaced it with a monoculture so total that the world's biosphere consisted of exactly 1 species of plant and the 62 million humans who tended it. We made planetfall at a transit hub near Processing Station Primus Alpha, the administrative center for Solvon Prime's agricultural operations. The delegation was met by a man named Overseer Comptable Drennig, a thin, efficient bureaucrat who wore his filtration mask pushed up on his forehead like a cap, exposing a face that had been weathered to leather by years of chemical air. He greeted the procurement agents and the logistics coordinator with the practiced warmth of a man who had done this many times. He greeted me with less warmth because assayers on inspection visits were, in his experience, people who made his life more complicated. The standard inspection protocol took 3 days. The procurement agents reviewed yield data with the overseer Comptable's staff. The logistics coordinator inspected the storage and shipping facilities, and I was given access to the processing stations to evaluate current harvest samples. This was my legitimate reason for being on Solvon Prime, and I performed it dutifully. I visited 4 processing stations, tasted samples from each, and filed my evaluations. The metallic note was present in every sample, stronger here at the source than it had been in the blended product back on Threnok. I noted it in my reports without comment beyond the technical observation. What I also noted, in the privacy of my own thoughts, was the scale of the operation. People who drink Recaff tend to picture a simple chain. Leaf is grown, leaf is picked, leaf is dried and ground, leaf is shipped. The reality is an industrial process of staggering complexity. At Processing Station Primus Alpha, I watched cured leaf pass through a sequence of 15 separate mechanical operations before it was ready for packaging. The leaf was sorted by size and moisture content on vibrating screens. It was fed through roller mills that cracked the cellular structure to release the stimulant compounds. It was passed through chemical extraction chambers where pheromoxine stabilizers were applied in a precisely timed sequence. It was heated, cooled, dried, reheated, and ground to a specific particle size that the Administratum's distribution standards required for each grade. At every stage, samples were pulled and tested by local technicians, not trained assayers, but workers with enough instruction to operate the basic testing equipment that measured alkaloid concentration and moisture levels. The tests they ran were the same tests that our spectrometers ran back in the assay hall. The same 217 markers, the same certification standards, the same deliberate blindness to anything that fell outside the approved list. I also observed the packaging operation, where processed leaf stalk was compressed into standardized blocks and sealed in moisture-resistant wrapping stamped with the Administratum's Bureau of Consumable Standards certification mark, the planet of origin, the processing facility code, and the grade designation. Each block weighed exactly 5 kilograms. Each cargo container held exactly 100 blocks. Each bulk carrier's hold could carry exactly 10,000 containers. The mathematics of the Recaff supply chain reduced to simple multiplication. 50 million kilograms per carrier load, enough processed leaf to supply a mid-tier hive world for approximately 1 standard month. Solvon Prime filled between 6 and 8 carriers per cycle. Call it 350 million kilograms of processed Recaff per standard year, shipped from one planet to feed the stimulant needs of a dozen others. And Solvon was one of 17 designated Recaff agri-worlds in the Corvalin subsector alone. Across the Segmentum Obscurus, the number of such worlds ran into the hundreds. Across the entire Imperium, thousands. The Recaff supply chain was one of the largest logistical operations in human history, exceeded in volume only by the Astra Militarum's supply infrastructure and the Administratum's own internal operations. All of it tasted wrong. Every sample, every batch, every processing station I visited. The metallic note was everywhere, threaded through the product like a signal nobody else could receive. On the 4th day, while the rest of the delegation was engaged in contract negotiations, I asked Drennig's office for permission to visit the equatorial growing zone. Specifically, I asked to visit the field supplying processing station Tertius Novum. I framed it as a quality investigation. The increased volume from Tertius Novum warranted a source-level evaluation to ensure consistency. It was, I understood later, exactly the wrong thing and exactly the right thing to ask. Wrong because Tertius Novum was the heart of the operation and no curious outsider should ever have been allowed near it. Right, because refusing a credentialed assayer's reasonable request would have generated more attention than granting it. Drennig's whole method was invisibility. A denied inspection becomes a flagged inspection, becomes a report that crosses a desk somewhere. Granting the visit, routing me through the sanitized parts under supervision, and sending me home with nothing on paper was the safer play, and Drennig had clearly made it before. He approved the request, assigned me a ground transport and a driver, and sent me south. The arrangement was supposed to keep me handled at every step. The driver to and from the station manager once I was inside. It nearly worked. The drive took 6 hours across a landscape that I will carry behind my eyes for the rest of my life. The transit corridor was a raised permacrete road, elevated 3 meters above the surrounding fields, and from that slight vantage I could see the leaf rows stretching away in every direction, perfectly straight, perfectly uniform, disappearing into the chemical haze like lines converging on a vanishing point that didn't exist. Workers moved between the rows, hundreds of them, thousands of them, visible as dark shapes against the dark foliage, bent at the waist, picking. Their hands moved with a mechanical regularity that unsettled me in a way I couldn't immediately identify. Not fast, not slow, just constant, the same motion, repeated, without variation, without pause. I watched for 20 minutes through the transport's window, and I did not see a single worker stop, stretch, adjust their mask, wipe their brow, or make any movement that was not directly related to the act of picking leaves. They moved like servitors, but they were not servitors. Servitors don't bend. Servitors have augmetic limbs. These were human beings, and they were performing with a uniformity that human beings are not supposed to achieve. "How long do they pick?" I asked the driver. 16-hour shifts, he said. He was a local, born on Solvon, with the mask-scarred face and chemical-roughened voice of a lifelong field worker who had been promoted to transport duties. 2 shifts a day, 1 hour break between. Sleep? 6 hours in the hab blocks. What do they eat? Standard rations, processed grain, nutrient supplement, he paused, and Recaff. 3 allocations per shift. 3 cups per shift, 2 shifts per day, 6 cups of Recaff daily, for a workforce of 62 million. I did the arithmetic in my head and felt something cold settle in my stomach. 372 million cups of Recaff per day, consumed by the very people who grew the leaf that went into the cups. The Ouroboros of Imperial production, the workers grew the stimulant that kept them working so they could grow more stimulant. "Same Recaff they ship out?" I asked. The driver glanced at me in the reflector. "No. Local blend, different processing." "Different how?" He shrugged. "Don't know. Tastes the same to me." But it wouldn't taste the same to me. I was already certain of that. We reached the equatorial zone by late afternoon. The fields here were denser, the bushes taller, the foliage so thick and dark it looked almost black. The air was worse here too. Even through the transport's sealed cabin and my own filtration mask, I could feel a chemical bite at the back of my throat. The driver told me the equatorial zone had the highest fertilizer concentrations on the planet, because the soil here had been under continuous cultivation the longest. 800 years of growing the same crop in the same dirt. The original topsoil was gone. What remained was an artificial medium, a slurry of chemical compounds and organic amendments pumped into the ground through a network of buried irrigation pipes. The bushes grew not because the soil nourished them, but because the chemical cocktail forced them to grow. They were not plants in any natural sense. They were biological machines, fed inputs and producing outputs, and the leaf they bore was as artificial as the soil they grew in. processing station Tertius Novum was a low, sprawling complex of hab blocks and industrial buildings surrounded by a perimeter of razor wire and automated sentry guns. Not unusual for a processing station on an agri-world. The product was valuable. The tithe depended on it. Security was standard. What was unusual was the smell. Even through my mask, even through the chemical reek of the fertilizer haze, I caught something else when I stepped out of the transport. Something organic, rich, heavy, like meat that's been left too long in a warm room. Like the rendering plants in the lower hive, where the dead are processed. Familiar, but wrong here, on an agri-world where the only organic output was supposed to be leaf stock. The station's on-site manager, a woman named Harvester Subprime Lecken Cove, met me at the intake gate. She was younger than I expected for someone running the most productive processing station on the planet. 30, maybe. Hard to tell with the mask scarring and the chemical weathering. She had the calm, measured demeanor of a person who is very good at their job and wants you to know it. She gave me the standard tour, the drying halls, where fresh-picked leaf was laid on heated racks and slowly dehydrated over 72 hours. The curing chambers, where dried leaf was sealed in pressurized vaults and treated with chemical fixatives to stabilize the stimulant compounds. The grinding mills, where cured leaf was processed into the fine powder that would be shipped off-world as raw stock. Everything was clean, everything was efficient, everything was exactly as it should be, and none of it explained the metallic taste in my mouth or the smell of rendering that hung in the air outside. I asked to see the fertilizer distribution system. Lecken looked at me with the first flicker of something that wasn't professional composure. The fertilizer system is agricultural infrastructure, not processing. It's outside the scope of a quality inspection. The quality of the leaf depends on the quality of the soil. The quality of the soil depends on the fertilizer. I need to see the inputs to evaluate the outputs. It was a reasonable argument, and she couldn't refuse a credentialed assayer's request without generating paperwork that would draw attention she clearly didn't want. She took me to the fertilizer distribution hub, a building on the western edge of the compound, connected to the main complex by a covered corridor that smelled of chemicals and, underneath the chemicals, that same rendering smell, stronger now, persistent, undeniable. The distribution hub was where the irrigation system's inputs were mixed and pumped into the buried pipe network that fed the surrounding fields. It was a large space, industrial, filled with mixing vats and pump machinery, and the constant low throb of fluid being forced through kilometers of underground conduit. The vats contained the standard agricultural chemicals I expected: nitrate solutions, phosphate suspensions, trace mineral compounds, standard inputs for industrial-scale agriculture. But in the back of the facility, separated from the main mixing area by a partition wall, there were additional vats, smaller, sealed, connected to the main irrigation line by a secondary pump system that fed directly into the primary flow. "What's in those?" I asked. Lecken hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely perceptible, but I caught it the way I catch a faint off note in a blend. A fraction of a second where she was deciding what to tell me. Organic amendment. She didn't look at the vats as she answered. Standard practice. The soil requires organic input to maintain microbial activity. We supplement with processed biological material. From what source? Local. Recycled from the habitation blocks. I looked at her. She looked back. Neither of us blinked. In the Imperium, recycled biological material from the habitation blocks means exactly one thing. It means the dead. It means the workers who die in the fields from chemical exposure, from exhaustion, from the slow organ failure that comes with decades of breathing filtered poison, from the injuries that accumulate when you pick leaves 16 hours a day and your hands have been corroded by alkaloid residue until the bones show through the skin. It means those bodies are collected, rendered down, and fed back into the soil that grows the crop that feeds the Imperium's appetite for its morning cup. This was not a surprise. I told you earlier that the recycling of human biological material into organic substrate is an open secret across the Imperium. On a hive world, the dead enter the processing chain. On an agri-world, it's the same. The dead return to the soil grows the crop. The crop is harvested, processed, shipped, and consumed by billions of people who prefer not to think about it. This was standard. This was known. This was not the dark truth. A Vox unit chimed against Lekken's collar. She glanced at it, then at me, and something moved behind her eyes, the calculation of a person weighing two competing duties. She could keep watching the inspector, or she could answer a summons from the station's main complex, and one of those carried consequences, and the other did not. She told me to wait by the intake door and stepped into the corridor, her voice dropping into the clipped register people use when a superior is on the line. I did not wait by the intake door. The dark truth was in the sealed vats. I didn't need to open them. I am a blend-assayer, and my pallet works whether I want it to or not. The secondary pump system had a junction point where the sealed line connected to the main irrigation feed, and at that junction there was a manual bleed valve, the kind used to purge air pockets from liquid lines. The valve was closed, but the housing was wet. Condensation, I thought at first. Then I touched it and brought my fingers to my nose. The smell was concentrated, intense, not chemical, biological. My palate parsed it involuntarily. Organic nitrogen compounds, lipid breakdown products, and underneath all of it, the metallic note. The same note that was in the leaf. The same note that was in every cup of Grade Tertius that had come through my assay hall for the past 8 months. But here at the source it was unmistakable. This was not a trace compound absorbed by plants from degraded soil. This was a primary substance, dense with biological activity, being deliberately pumped into the irrigation system that fed the fields. I knelt beside the feed junction and pressed my ear to the pipe. The liquid moving through it was warm enough to heat the metal. Warm in the way that living systems are warm. Not heated by an external element, warm because something inside was metabolically active. I had spent 22 years reading the temperature of Recaff infusions to evaluate brewing parameters. I knew the difference between applied heat and generated heat. The liquid in those pipes was alive. I stood up, wiped my fingers on my coat, turned around. Lecken was standing in the doorway of the distribution hub, watching me, not with surprise, not with anger, with the resigned expression of someone who has been expecting this moment and has already decided how it will end. You touched the bleed valve. It wasn't a question. I said nothing. The bleed valve is not part of the fertilizer distribution system. It's part of a supplementary feed line installed 18 months ago by a bureau engineering team. You were not supposed to see it. You were not supposed to touch it. And you were not supposed to be here without an escort, which you are, because I made the mistake of stepping out to answer a Vox call instead of watching the one inspector in 18 months who actually looked at the pipes instead of the product. She walked closer. She was not armed. She was a harvester subprime, not a soldier. But her voice had the quality of someone who operates within a system that doesn't require her to carry a weapon, because the system itself is the weapon. I don't know what you think you found, she said. I don't know what questions you think you're going to ask when you get back to your hive world. But I will tell you this, blend-assayer. This station has had 4 quality inspectors in the past 18 months. You are the first one who asked to see the fertilizer system. The previous 3 tasted the samples, filed their reports, and went home. 2 of them are still working. The third asked a question about the soil composition during a routine debrief. She was reassigned 3 days later. I don't know where. She held my gaze. Behind her, through the open doorway, I could see the chemical haze over the fields and the dark shapes of workers moving between the rows, picking with that mechanical precision that I could no longer pretend was normal. I am telling you this because I have been on this planet for 9 years, and I have drunk the local blend for all of them, and I can feel it working, Dresk. I can feel the edges going soft. Every year a little more. And if I still have enough left in me to warn you, then you still have enough left in you to listen. I walked out of the distribution hub. I walked back to the transport. I told the driver to take me to the transit hub, and I did not look back at Lecken Cove standing in the doorway of the facility, watching me leave, knowing that she had just spent one of the last clear moments she would ever have on a stranger who might not survive long enough for the warning to matter. On the drive back to the transit hub, I sat in the back of the transport and thought about what I had seen. Not the dead in the soil. That was old horror, the kind you learn to carry because putting it down isn't an option. What I was thinking about was the liquid in the sealed vat. Warm, alive, moving with purpose. And the metallic taste that I now understood was not a contaminant, but a product. Something was being introduced into the soil intentionally, something biological, something active, and it was being absorbed by the Recaff plants and incorporated into the leaf and shipped across the subsector in every batch of processed blend that left Solvon Prime. I thought about 62 million workers picking leaves with mechanical precision. I thought about 3 changes of governor in 12 years. I thought about the procurement delegation back at the transit hub, finalizing contracts for next cycle's supply, stamping their approval on shipments that would become the morning cup for 14 billion people on Threnach Septimus alone. And I thought about the fact that I had been spitting my samples for 22 years, while everyone else in the mid-hive had been swallowing theirs. I returned to Threnach Septimus with the delegation. I filed my assay reports. I certified the current harvest quality as within acceptable parameters, which it was by every measurable standard that the Bureau of Consumable Standards recognized. I did not mention the sealed vats. I did not mention the bleed valve or the living warmth in the pipes. I did not mention the workers who moved like machines, or the 3 dead governors, or Lecken Cove's warning, which still sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. The first thing I did after filing my reports was go to the Rust Cup on level 13 to find Mikkel Torve. He wasn't there. The bartender, a thick-armed woman with chemical burns on her forearms, said Mikkel hadn't been in for 2 weeks. I went to the loading docks on level 12. Mikkel's shift supervisor told me that Mikkel had been transferred to a different facility. Which facility? The supervisor checked his records. The transfer order had come from outside the compact, from an Administratum labor allocation office. It listed no destination. Mikkel Torve had been reassigned to nowhere, effective 8 days ago, which meant it had happened while I was on Solvon Prime, while I was kneeling beside a bleed valve and smelling something alive in a pipe that should have contained dead chemistry. The man who had sourced my raw leaf samples had been removed from his position and redirected to a location that didn't officially exist, and the timing made it clear that this was not a coincidence. Someone had traced the smuggled leaf stock back to its source, and Mikkel had paid for my curiosity. I did not look for him. Looking for Mikkel would have meant asking questions through official channels, and official channels were exactly the system that had taken him. I added his name to the weight I was carrying and kept moving. So I did the only thing a mid-hive tradesman with limited resources and an obsessive commitment to a bad taste can do. I started reading. The compact's trade archive was limited to commercial records, but Hive Morren had a public data archive on level 32, maintained by the Administratum's Department of Public Information. It was not a library in any meaningful sense. It was a vast, dim hall filled with data terminals, most of them broken, staffed by 3 ancient clerks who had been assigned to the facility so long ago that the original assignment orders had been lost, and their continued employment was maintained purely by bureaucratic inertia. The archive contained, in theory, the accumulated public records of the Corvalin subsector, census data, tithe reports, regulatory filings, and, crucially, the publicly available portions of the Bureau of Consumable Standards certification database. I started going to the archive after my shifts, 3, 4, 5 nights a week. I would sit at a functioning terminal and search through regulatory filings related to Recaff production, processing, and distribution. The database was vast and poorly organized, and most of my searches returned thousands of irrelevant results. But I was patient. I was a blend-assayer. I was trained to sit for hours, evaluating tiny variations in identical samples, waiting for the one note that didn't belong. I could sit in front of a data terminal all night. The first thing I learned was the history of the word itself. Recaff, an abbreviation of recafficinated, a term that originated during the early centuries of the Imperium's expansion, when colonists on newly settled worlds attempted to replicate the caffeinated beverages of Old Terra using locally available plant species. The original Terran caffeine-bearing plant had been transported off-world during the Great Crusade and established on several colony worlds, but it proved temperamental. It required specific growing conditions that most colony worlds couldn't provide. The alternative was to cultivate native leaf-bearing plants that could be processed to produce a similar stimulant effect, then artificially enrich the resulting beverage with extracted or synthetic caffeine compounds to replicate the dosage profile of true coffee. Hence, recaffeinated, a synthetic reproduction of something that had once been natural. The very name was a confession of artificiality embedded in the language so deeply that nobody heard it anymore. Over the millennia, the term had become generic. Recaff referred not to a specific plant or process, but to any hot stimulant beverage produced from leaf stalk and distributed through Imperial channels. Different worlds grew different plants, different processing methods produced different flavor profiles. But the Administratum, in its drive for standardization, had gradually homogenized the product to the point where most consumers could not distinguish between leaf stalks from different worlds. The diversity that had once characterized the trade had been compressed into the grading system. 4 tiers, 4 price points, 4 levels of quality that corresponded, I now understood, to 4 levels of chemical compliance. I also learned about Tana. Real Tana, not the synthetic version. Tana was a specific variety of recaff associated with certain Astra Militarum regiments, particularly those from the Sabbat Worlds region. It had a distinctive profile that seasoned assayers could identify blindfolded. Earthy, slightly smoky, with a warmth that lingered longer than standard blends. Some regiments considered their particular Tana blend to be as much a part of their identity as their regimental colors. Soldiers who had served for decades on the front lines, drinking Tana from the same supply chain that had fed their grandfathers, developed a loyalty to the beverage that bordered on the devotional. They drank it before battle. They drank it after. They drank it over the bodies of their dead, in the ruins of conquered cities, in the mud of trenches that spanned continents. It was, for many of them, the last familiar thing in a universe of horror. I wondered, sitting in that archive, whether the Tana those soldiers loved had carried the same invisible rider as the Recaff in my assay hall. Whether the Korvalin subsector was the only region running this program, or whether every subsector had its own version of Directive Vermilion, its own quiet arrangement between the Munitorum and the Bureau, its own buried footnotes, I had no way to know. But the architecture of the system, the certification exemptions, the agricultural integration, those could be replicated anywhere, on any world, in any cup. What I found over the course of 3 months of searching was a story told in regulatory codes and tithe amendments and bureau memoranda. A story that nobody had ever assembled into a single narrative, because the pieces were scattered across 800 years of Administratum record-keeping. A story about Recaff. The first piece was the certification standard itself. The Bureau of Consumable Standards' current standard for Grade Tertius Recaff listed 217 chemical markers that incoming product was required to meet. These markers covered stimulant concentration, pH levels, heavy metal content, microbial count, and a range of other safety-related parameters. What the markers did not cover, and what I now understood was deliberately excluded, was neuroactive compound profiling. The standard did not test for, and therefore could not detect, any substance that affected neural function beyond the expected stimulant effect of caffeine and caffeine analogs. This absence was not an oversight. I found the memorandum that established it. Bureau of Consumable Standards Internal Directive 774-Kesh, dated 611 years before my birth, authored by a Bureau official whose name had been redacted from the record. The directive stated, in language so dense with Administratum jargon that I had to read it 9 times before I understood what it was saying, that neuroactive compound assessment protocols shall be excluded from standard certification procedures for Grade Tertius and Grade Quartus Recaff products, in accordance with Directive Vermilion Sigma 01, issued by the Office of Planetary Compliance, Sub-Bureau of the Departmento Munitorum. Directive Vermilion Sigma 01. I searched for it. The public database did not contain it. But the reference was there, embedded in the certification standard like a bone fragment in a body that nobody had ever X-rayed. A Munitorum directive that explicitly exempted lower-grade Recaff from neuroactive compound testing. Why would the Departmento Munitorum, which was responsible for military logistics, care about the certification standards for a civilian beverage? The answer took me another month to find, buried in a tithe assessment amendment from 400 years ago. The amendment adjusted the tithe grade for 17 agri-worlds in the Korvalin subsector, including Sulvon Prime, and it included a footnote. A single footnote appended to the end of a document that ran to 300 pages. The footnote referenced an attachment. Compliance Supplementation Schedule, Korvalin Subsector, revised. The attachment was not in the public database, but the footnote described its purpose in 3 words that I read and reread until they burned into my memory. Neurocompliance agent dosing. Neurocompliance agents. In the Recaff. Not a contaminant. Not an accident. A scheduled, regulated, deliberately administered neurocompliance agent introduced into the Recaff supply at the agricultural level, managed through the Departmento Munitorum, and exempted from detection by a Bureau of Consumable Standards directive that had been in place for over 6 centuries. The Recaff was not just a stimulant. It had never been just a stimulant. The re in Recaff didn't just mean recaffeinated. It meant reformulated. A delivery mechanism for a chemical that dampened independent thought, suppressed curiosity, and reinforced behavioral patterns consistent with productive labor. Every cup, every day. For centuries. I thought about Hannock. 2 cups before his shift, 1 during, one after. 25 years of daily dosing. His flat expression when I reported the metallic note wasn't indifference. It was the agent working. I thought about the workers on Solvon Prime. 6 cups per day. They weren't just compliant. They were optimized. Whatever the standard neurocompliance agent did, the substance in the soil did it better. And it was being rolled out. That was what the processing consolidation meant. That was why processing station Tertius Novum was handling 40% of the planet's output. Tertius Novum was in the equatorial zone, where the sealed vats were, where the enhanced biological agent was being pumped into the soil. The product from Tertius Novum carried the new compound. As its share of the planet's total output increased, more and more of the Recaff leaving Solvon Prime would contain the enhanced agent instead of the standard one. And Solvon Prime supplied not just the compact Varadin, but dozens of other distributors across the subsector. Millions of tons of processed leaf stock, shipping to hundreds of hive worlds and forge worlds and military supply depots, all gradually shifting from the old compliance formula to the new one. Somebody was upgrading the system. Somebody had looked at 6 centuries of chemical pacification through the Recaff supply and decided it could be done better. I went back to the archive the next night, and the next. I searched for Directive Vermilion Sigma 01 through every pathway the public database offered. Cross-references, citation indices, footnote trails, amendment records. The directive itself remained inaccessible, classified at a level that a blend-assayer's data clearance could not touch. But I found references to it in other documents, other amendments, other footnotes. Each one added a small piece to the picture. The directive was old, much older than the certification standard exemption that referenced it. The earliest citation I could find placed it at over 2,000 years old, originating from the Departmento Munitorum during a period of sector-wide instability when 3 hive worlds in the Corvalin subsector had experienced simultaneous worker uprisings. The uprisings had been put down by the Astra Militarum, but the Munitorum's assessment of the situation had concluded that military suppression was unsustainable. The hive worlds needed their workers alive and functional, not dead or imprisoned. The solution had to be preventive, not reactive. It had to be undetectable because a population that knew it was being chemically controlled would resist. And it had to be universal, reaching every level of the workforce simultaneously. Recaff was the answer, the one thing that every worker on every world consumed multiple times a day without exception. The perfect delivery system, invisible, ubiquitous, and already associated with feelings of comfort and routine and the small daily ritual of normalcy that makes the grinding horror of Imperial life bearable. The Munitorum had commissioned the development of a neurocompliance compound. They had arranged for its production and integration into the Recaff supply chain at the agricultural level. They had issued the directive mandating its inclusion. They had arranged for the Bureau of Consumable Standards to exempt it from testing, and then they had buried the paper trail so deep that finding it required 3 months of obsessive searching through 800 years of Administratum records by a man with nothing better to do with his nights and a palate that wouldn't let him rest. I found one more thing. The most recent reference to Directive Vermilion Sigma 01 was not old. It was dated 18 months ago. It was a memo from a sub-bureau of the Departmento Munitorum that I had never heard of, an office called the Bureau of Supplemental Compliance, addressed to the planetary governance structure of 14 agri-worlds in the Corvalin subsector. The memo authorized, in language wrapped in enough bureaucratic padding to suffocate a grox, a revised supplementation protocol employing bio-derived neurocompliance agents of enhanced efficacy and reduced detection profile. The memo listed the agri-worlds by designation code, One of them was Solvon Prime, bio-derived, not chemical, biological, the liquid in the sealed vats at processing station Tertius Novum, the warm, living substance being pumped into the soil, the metallic taste in the leaf. The standard compliance agent, the one that had been in the Recaff for 6 centuries, was a chemical compound, synthetic, manufactured. It worked slowly, cumulatively, building up in the neural tissue over years of daily consumption. It was effective but imprecise, a blunt instrument that reduced emotional range and cognitive initiative without specificity. The new agent was biological, organic, something that had been grown or cultured, not synthesized. And if my palate was right, if the taste profile I was reading from the Solvon leaf stalk was accurate, it was derived from human neural tissue. That was what was in the sealed vats. Not rendered corpse material being recycled as fertilizer. A cultured compound extracted from human neural tissue, processed into a bioactive agent, and fed into the soil of an entire planet's agricultural infrastructure. The workers who died in the fields of Solvon Prime were not just being recycled. Their brains were being harvested. Their neural tissue was being processed into the very substance that would control the next generation of workers on 100 worlds across the subsector. The dead were not fertilizer. They were the drug. I left the archive that night and walked home through the corridors of Hive Morren, and the corridors were full of people, because they are always full of people. 14 billion souls packed into 6 hive clusters, and every single one of them was carrying a cup. Tin cups, ceramic cups, disposable pressed fiber cups from the vendor stalls that line every transit corridor in the mid-hive. Some held the cups in both hands, warming their fingers. Some drank as they walked, the liquid leaving brown rings on their lips. Some had the distant, satisfied look that comes with the first sip of the morning, the chemical warmth spreading through the system, the stimulant kicking in, the world becoming slightly more bearable for a few hours. And underneath the stimulant, underneath the warmth, underneath the small comfort of routine, the compliance agent was working, had been working, for 2,000 years, softening the edges of consciousness, filing down the rough surfaces of independent thought, making the unacceptable acceptable, making the intolerable tolerable, making 47 million people capable of living in a vertical prison without ever, not once, looking up at the ceiling and asking why. I did not drink Recaff that night. I did not drink it the next day. I emptied my personal stock down the sanitary drain and unplugged my brewer and sat on my cot and stared at the wall and thought about what to do with what I knew. 22 years of spitting instead of swallowing. That was it. That was the only reason I could see what nobody else could see. Not intelligence, not courage. An accident of protocol. A week after I stopped drinking Recaff, Provost Hanek Drull called me into his office. He closed the door. He sat behind his desk. He looked at me with that flat expression I had learned to read as chemical complacency, and he said words that rearranged the architecture of my situation, the way an explosive charge rearranges the architecture of a building. "The compact has received a request from the Bureau of Supplemental Compliance," he said, "regarding your recent activities at the Public Data Archive on Level 32. The Bureau of Supplemental Compliance, the sub-bureau that had authored the memo authorizing the new bio-derived compliance agent. They knew I had been searching for their directive. They knew what I had found. Of course they knew. The data terminals in the public archive were monitored. Every search query was logged. Every access was recorded. I had spent 3 months sitting in a public facility using my personal identification credentials, searching for classified Departmento Munitorum directives, and I had been so absorbed in the puzzle that I had never once considered the possibility that the puzzle was watching me solve it. "What kind of request?" I asked. Hanek's expression didn't change. "They've asked the compact to facilitate a meeting between you and a representative of their bureau, here, tomorrow." "And if I decline?" Hanek looked at me for a long time. Then he picked up the cup of Recaff on his desk, the cup that was always on his desk, the cup that he refilled 4 times a day with standard Grade Tertius blend, and he took a slow, deliberate sip. "Decline what, Kellun?" he said. "Nobody's asked you a question." I went home. I did not sleep. In the morning, I went to the compact's offices on level 47 and sat in the small conference room adjacent to Hanek's office and waited for the representative of the Bureau of Supplemental Compliance. I did not know what to expect. An interrogator, maybe. An enforcer. Someone with the authority to make inconvenient people disappear, which was something the Imperium had refined into an art form over 10,000 years of practice. What walked through the door was a woman in the gray robes of a mid-ranking Administratum official, carrying a data slate and a porcelain cup of what I could smell. From across the room was Grade Primus Recaff. Real leaf. Single origin. Expensive enough to buy my HAB unit 10 times over. She was older than me, maybe 60, with the thin, precise features of someone who had been selecting her own genetics for several generations. She sat down across from me, placed her cup on the table, and looked at me with an expression that was the opposite of Hanek's. Where Hanek was flat, she was sharp, attentive, aware. Like a predator that doesn't need to be aggressive because it knows it's already won. "Blend-assayer Dresk," she said. "My name is Comptroller Vicarius Elene Rorsk. I oversee the implementation of revised supplementation protocols for the Korvalin subsector. You've been looking for my work. I thought we should talk." She did not offer me her Recaff. She did not offer me anything. She placed her data slate on the table and activated it, and the screen displayed a list of my search queries from the public archive, organized by date and cross-referenced with the documents I had accessed. "You're thorough." She scrolled the data slate with one finger. "Most people who stumble onto Directive Vermilion stop at the first reference. They assume it's a classification error and move on. You went looking for the footnotes. I'm a blend-assayer. Footnotes are my job. Your job is to taste Recaff and certify it for distribution. What you've been doing is not your job. It is, in fact, several categories of security breach, any one of which would justify your immediate detention, processing, and reassignment to a penal labor detail." She paused, and her next words were delivered with the casual precision of someone stating a self-evident fact. "Or servitor conversion, depending on the assessment of the reviewing authority." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. "However," she continued, and the word landed like a conditional clause in a contract that you know is about to redefine the terms. "However, the Bureau values initiative. It values attention to detail, and it values, above all, the ability to detect what others cannot. Your palette identified the new compliance agent in a blended Grade Tertius product at concentrations that our own laboratory instrumentation registers only with difficulty. That makes you useful, and in the Imperium, usefulness is the closest thing to a pardon. What do you want?" "I want to hear what you think you know. Then I'll tell you what you're missing." So I told her. Everything. The metallic note, the raw leaf samples, the sealed vats and the bleed valve on Sulvon Prime, and the liquid that was warm from within, the processing consolidation at Tertius Novum, the workers who moved like machines, the 3 governors, Lecken Cove's warning, Mechel's disappearance, the certification standard exemption, Directive Vermilion Sigma 01, the neurocompliance footnote, the Bureau of Supplemental Compliance memo authorizing revised supplementation protocols across 14 agri-worlds. I laid it out the way I would lay out an assay evaluation. Primary notes, body, finish. And when I was done, I told her what I believed it meant. The Imperium has been adding a neurocompliance agent to the Recaff supply through the agricultural soil on designated agri-worlds, Grade Tertius and below. The agent suppresses independent thought and reinforces behavioral compliance in the consuming population. It's been running for centuries, possibly millennia. The Bureau of Consumable Standards exempts it from testing under a Munitorum directive. And now you're replacing the standard chemical compound with something biological, something derived from human neural tissue, something that's being cultured in those vats on Sulvon Prime and fed into the irrigation system and absorbed into the leaf. Rorsk looked at me with an expression that was not quite surprise but adjacent to it, the way a Grade Tertius blend is adjacent to real leaf product. "Your palate is even better than your file suggests," she said. "You got the timeline wrong, though. The program is older than you think. 2,312 years, not centuries, millennia." She corrected my details. Not all of them. Most of what I had assembled was accurate. The program had begun after a series of worker uprisings that nearly destroyed 6 productive hive worlds in the subsector. 3 worlds simultaneously, coordinated through labor agitators distributing pamphlets that said things that were true, which made them dangerous. The Administratum suppressed the uprisings at a cost of 400,000 dead, 11 months of fighting, and a 3-year tithe shortfall that cascaded across the subsector. The Departmento Munitorum's assessment concluded that military suppression was effective but unsustainable. The problem was not the conditions. The conditions were the Imperium. The problem was the workers' capacity to object to the conditions. A research directive went to the biologist division of the Adeptus Mechanicus, requesting a compound that would reduce what the researchers clinically termed aspiration beyond station. The compound was developed. The delivery mechanism was Recaff. The Bureau of Consumable Standards was instructed to look the other way. And within a generation, the uprising stopped. Not because anything improved, because the capacity for objection was erased. "That part you had," she leaned forward. "What you missed is the other half of the system." "The other half?" "You said Grade Primus is exempt from the compliance agent. You're correct, but you assumed that exempt means clean." She took a sip from her porcelain cup, and for the first time I noticed the way her eyes moved when she drank. The slight dilation, the momentary sharpening of focus. Not the glazed satisfaction of a worker drinking Grade Tertius. Something else. Something active. Grade Primus is not clean, blend-assayer Dresk. Grade Primus contains a cognitive enhancer, a compound developed alongside the compliance agent by the same biologist division under the same research directive. The compliance agent suppresses neural function in the working population. The enhancer amplifies it in the administrative class. Faster processing, sharper recall, enhanced pattern recognition, the ability to see connections that an unmedicated mind would miss. I stared at her. She drank again, that sharpness in her eyes. The grading system is not a quality gradient. She set her cup down. It is a caste system, administered through a beverage. Grade Quartus, maximum suppression, minimum cost. Grade Tertius, standard suppression, standard distribution. Grade Secundus, mild suppression, comfortable middle. Grade Primus, cognitive enhancement, ruling class. 4 tiers, 4 chemical profiles, 4 levels of human capability, determined not by genetics or education or ability, but by which cup you can afford to drink. I thought about the 2 times per year that I tasted Grade Primus. That alive quality. I had attributed it to craftsmanship. It was the enhancer. A flash of pharmaceutical clarity gone within hours. Then what's changing? I asked. The new compound, the biological agent. Why replace something that works? Rorsk's expression changed. For the first time, she looked not predatory, but practical. An engineer discussing an upgrade. The standard compound has limitations. Her tone shifted from revelation to engineering. It requires sustained daily intake over months to achieve full effect. It is vulnerable to metabolic variation, meaning that approximately 3% of the population develops partial resistance, and it does not transmit. Each generation must be dosed individually. The biological agent addresses all three limitations. She explained. The biological agent was not a synthetic chemical. It was a cultured neuroactive organism derived from human neural tissue, specifically from the cerebrospinal fluid and glial cells of subjects who had already been fully saturated with the standard compound. The organism was, in a sense, the compound's successor. It carried the same neuroactive properties, but in a living, self-replicating form. When absorbed through the digestive system, it colonized the host's neural tissue within weeks, not months. It was not subject to metabolic resistance because it adapted to the host's individual neurochemistry, and most importantly, it was transmissible. Subjects colonized by the biological agent shed trace quantities of the organism through their breath, their sweat, their skin contact. Within a closed population, a single colonized individual could passively expose hundreds of others within a standard month. The implications were obvious. The standard compound required continuous agricultural production and distribution. It required every cup, every day, forever. The biological agent was self-propagating. Once it achieved critical mass in a population, the Recaff itself would become unnecessary. The compliance effect would sustain itself, spread itself. A self-perpetuating system of chemical obedience that required no infrastructure, no supply chain, no agricultural world growing contaminated leaf in poisoned soil. Just people living in close proximity, sharing air and surfaces and the incidental contact of daily life in a crowded hive, passing the agent from body to body like a disease that nobody knew they had. You're breeding compliance into the species, I said. We're ensuring stability, Rorsk said, permanently. Solvon Prime, 62 million walking dead who still picked leaves on schedule. That was the prototype. The governor changes on Solvon Prime, I said, 3 in 12 years. Early-stage implementation challenges, Rorsk said. The first governor refused the revised protocol. He was replaced. The second attempted to report the biological agent to the subsector Administratum. She was replaced. The third accepted the protocol but proved incapable of managing the transition. He was replaced with Overseer Comptable Drenig, who is not a governor. He is a Bureau appointee. The Bureau has assumed direct operational control of Solvon Prime's agricultural output for the duration of the rollout. 3 governors. 2 of them killed for resistance, 1 for incompetence. And now the Bureau itself was running the planet, because the planet wasn't just an agri-world anymore. It was a production facility for a bioweapon designed to permanently lobotomize the working population of the Imperium, and the weapon was being distributed in the morning cup. 14 agri-worlds, I said, remembering the memo. The revised protocol covers 14 worlds. Initially, the first phase targets the Corvalin subsector. Successful implementation will inform expansion to adjacent subsectors. The projected timeline for full segmentum coverage is 40 years. 40 years. Within 40 years, every cup of Grade Tertius and Grade Quartus Recaff in the segmentum obscurus would carry the biological agent. Every worker, every guardsman, Every lower hive inhabitant, every human being who couldn't afford Grade Primus would be colonized. And once colonized, they would spread it to everyone around them. The agent would move through the population like a tide, and when it receded, what remained would be a workforce that was not merely compliant but biologically incapable of anything else. Not servitors. Servitors are recognized as machines. These would still look human, still walk and talk and eat and sleep and procreate and raise children who would be born into bodies already colonized by the organism. They would be human in every way except the one that mattered. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you found it," Rorsk said, "and because you have a palette that can detect the biological agent at concentrations below our laboratory threshold. The Bureau's current quality control methodology relies on chemical analysis, which is adequate for the standard compound, but insufficient for the biological agent. We need a human detection system, a trained assayer who can evaluate deployment batches and confirm agent presence in distributed product. You, blend-assayer Dresk, are exactly that system. You want me to work for you. I want you to continue doing exactly what you've been doing for 22 years, tasting Recaff, evaluating quality, certifying product for distribution. The only difference is that now, instead of checking for flavor consistency, you'll be checking for agent viability, making sure every cup that leaves the processing stations carries the correct dose, making sure the rollout proceeds on schedule. And if I refuse?" Rorsk looked at me. She did not answer. She reached into her robe and produced a small porcelain cup, identical to her own, and placed it on the table in front of me. It was filled with Recaff. I could smell it from where I sat. Grade Tertius, standard blend, and underneath the flat mineral base and the mild astringency and the short clean finish, the metallic note, the biological agent, warm and alive and waiting. The Bureau does not compel cooperation. She watched my face. The Bureau facilitates it. I looked at the cup. I looked at Rorsk. I looked at the door, which was closed, which I now understood had been locked when she entered, which I further understood was irrelevant, because there was nowhere on Threnok Septimus, nowhere in the Corvalin subsector, nowhere in the Imperium of man that did not have the Recaff supply chain reaching into it like a root system into soil. "If I drink this," I said, "I lose the palate." "Yes. The biological agent colonizes neural tissue indiscriminately. Your sensory acuity would diminish over a period of weeks. You would lose the ability to detect the agent. You would lose the fine discrimination that makes you valuable as an assayer. Then I'm useless to you either way. If I cooperate, I'm a tool that works. If I drink, I'm a tool that's broken." Rorsk smiled. It was a thin smile, precise, the smile of someone who is accustomed to being underestimated and enjoys the moment when the other person catches up. "Not quite," she said. "If you cooperate, you're a tool that works, and I supply you with Grade Primus, not the commercial product, the Bureau-grade formulation, the full cognitive enhancement package. You'll think more clearly than you ever have. Your palate, already exceptional, will become something that my laboratory instruments cannot replicate. You will detect the biological agent at concentrations that no other human being alive can perceive. And you will do this while fully understanding what the cups contain, because understanding is what makes you effective." She was offering me elevation. Not just freedom from the compliance agent, but active enhancement. A seat at the table where the cups are different, and the minds are sharper, and the people look down on the billions below with the cool, calculating clarity of a species that has learned to manage its own herd. "And if I refuse both," I said, "if I don't cooperate and I don't drink, She looked at me the way someone looks at a question they expected, but hoped not to hear. "Then you are a security liability with no utility value. The Bureau does not maintain security liabilities." Mekkel, the third quality inspector from Lekken's count, Vosk Pellant, sitting in his hab unit with empty eyes. The system had many ways of making people disappear. She reached into her robe and produced a second cup, porcelain filled with Grade Primus, Bureau Grade, the Enhancer. She placed it beside the Tertius cup already on the table. "Take the night," she said. "Consider your options. The Bureau will be in contact tomorrow." She left. The door closed. I sat in the conference room with 2 cups of Recaff on the table in front of me. One was Grade Primus, the Recaff of the Enhanced, the cup that would make me sharper than I had ever been and bind me to the system that had been chemically castrating the human race for 23 centuries. The other was Grade Tertius, the Recaff of my people, the cup that would eat my mind and leave me content and compliant and incapable of understanding what had been taken from me. 2 cups, 2 futures. The Imperium, reduced to a choice between a beverage. I picked up the Grade Primus cup first. I held it under my nose and breathed in the steam. It smelled extraordinary. That depth, that complexity, that finish that lingered on the soft palate like something you never wanted to forget. And now I knew what I was smelling. The Enhancer. The compound that made the administrators sharper, faster, more capable than the people they administered, the compound that had been widening the gap between the rulers and the ruled for 2,300 years, not through education or effort or natural ability, but through a cup of Recaff that cost more than a mid-hive worker earned in a month. Rorsk drank this every day. Her sharp eyes, her rapid processing, her clinical awareness, all of it was at least partially pharmaceutical. She was not smarter than me. She was better medicated. And if I drank from this cup, I would become like her, elevated, enhanced, looking down from the spire at the billions below, seeing them clearly, understanding their chemical diminishment and certifying it, because that was the job. That was the tool she wanted me to be. Not a servant of the Bureau, a collaborator. A mid-hive man raised up by chemistry to the level of his betters, forever grateful for the elevation, forever complicit in its cost. I put it down. I picked up the Grade Tertius cup. The metallic note rose from it like heat from a wound. Vosk's face flashed through my mind. That bovine contentment, that emptiness where a brilliant man used to be. I sat in that room until the lumens dimmed for the night cycle and the corridors outside went quiet. Then I drank the Grade Tertius, all of it. I drank it because Rorsk had assumed that a man offered the cup of the ruling class would reach for elevation. But I was a mid-hive tradesman. I had been born on level 39. I had lived my entire life among the people who drank Grade Tertius, and I would not consent to look down on them from above, not even from the inside of my own skull. The metallic taste lingered on my palate as I walked home through the night corridors. It was the last thing my tongue would ever accurately assess. Within a year, the compulsion that had driven me to investigate, to dig through records looking for a truth that nobody wanted found, that compulsion would be gone, eaten by an organism that fed on the electrochemical activity of caring too much about things I couldn't change. In the morning, someone from the Bureau would come for my answer. They would find that I had already given it. An assayer who has consumed the biological agent is no longer useful as a detection instrument. They would be angry. They might process me anyway, out of spite or procedure, or the simple institutional reflex of punishing defiance. It didn't matter. By the time they decided what to do with me, the agent would already be at work, and whatever they did to my body, my mind would be somewhere else, somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't taste like anything at all. I walked through the corridors and I watched the early shift workers emerging from their hab blocks, reaching for their morning cups, and I felt, for the first time in my life, a kinship with them. Not pity, not horror, kinship. We were drinking the same thing now. We were going to the same place. The only difference was that I knew the destination, and by the time I arrived, I wouldn't remember that I'd ever known. The last thing I tasted before the agent started its work and my palate began its long decline was the morning Recaff from a vendor stall on level 39, Grade Tertius, standard blend. I held the cup in both hands and let the warmth seep into my fingers, and I drank it the way everyone else in the Imperium drank it, without spitting, without evaluating, without the trained, meticulous attention that had been the defining characteristic of my professional life. I just drank. It tasted fine.